This is flip video 5.4, fiscal and monetary policies. So this flip video, you're not really going to learn anything new, hopefully, because we have learned all of this before. We're just going to look at it all together. So we're going to look at fiscal and monetary policy being used together. We're going to make sure we understand the corrections to our economic gaps. So first, a brief review of our economic gaps. We'll start all the way over here on the left-hand side. This is our market economy at equilibrium. This is full employment. And then our next graph is our inflationary gap. This is where we are overemployed. We have high inflation. And then our next gap, this is our recessionary gap. We have high unemployment. We are below potential output. Throw back our inflationary gap, we're above potential. And then our last gap over here on the right-hand side, this is our stagflation gap. So this is when we have high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. So these are 4 market economies that we draw regularly. So now let's review how we fix them. So first we're going to start with correcting recession and stagflation. Since they're both on the left-hand side of long run, we'll go ahead and lump them in together. So no intervention is a self-correction. So in that recession, that means we're going to start to see a decrease in the nominal wages. And when we have a decrease in nominal wages, what's going to happen in short-run aggregate supply? Well, it's going to increase to correct that gap. Now, if we look at fiscal policy, the changes to government spending and the changes to taxes, well, we want to go ahead and increase government spending, which will increase aggregate demand. And then we can decrease taxes, which will increase consumer spending, which will then increase aggregate demand. Monetary policy is our change in the interest rate. So we want to increase the money supply, which will then decrease our nominal interest rate, which will increase investment spending, which will then increase aggregate demand. And then supply side economics is forcing production to close our economic gap. So we want to increase production here to close the recession. So how do we do that? We want to decrease corporate taxes. We want to decrease government regulations. And then we want to increase subsidies. So that's how we correct a recessionary gap and a stagflation gap. Now let's review correcting an expansion or our inflationary gap. So no intervention, we need short-run aggregate supply to decrease. So in this overinflation, we're going to have an increase in nominal wages, which will then decrease short-run aggregate supply to close the gap. Fiscal policy, we want to go ahead and decrease government spending, which will decrease aggregate demand, or we can increase taxes, which will decrease consumer spending, which will then decrease aggregate demand. Monetary policy is the change in interest rates, so we want to decrease the money supply, which will increase our nominal interest rates, which will then decrease investment spending, which will decrease aggregate demand. And now for supply side economics, that's forcing production to change, to correct this gap here, and we want to decrease production. So to do that, we're going to increase our corporate taxes. We're going to increase government regulations. And we're going to decrease subsidies. And that is how we would correct an inflationary gap. So what happens when fiscal and monetary policies are used together? So now we're going to look at what's actually going to happen when we use both of these policies, that they're both going to change aggregate demand to correct a gap. We're going to look at what happens when they're used together. So remember, expansionary fiscal policy is an increase in government spending, decrease in taxes to increase aggregate demand. And then expansionary fiscal policy is an increase in the money supply to decrease the nominal interest rate to increase investment spending, which will then increase aggregate demand. So when we use expansionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy, we both have the same change to aggregate demand, so that's good. But now let's look at our change to interest rate. Let's see if both of these actually have the same change to interest rate. So we already know that the interest rate is going to decrease in expansionary monetary policy. But what do you think is going to happen to the interest rate when we use expansionary fiscal policy? Well, remember, expansionary fiscal policy is going to lead to deficit spending. And when we go into deficit spending, we have to increase our demand for loanable funds, which will then increase the real interest rate. So now we have conflicting interest rate changes. Monetary policy has our interest rate decreasing, but fiscal policy has the interest rate increasing. So what's going to be the overall change to investment spending? Unknown. The interest rates are going in different directions, so the overall change to investment spending is unknown. I could also ask, what is the overall economic growth change? What's going to happen to economic growth because of these interest rate discrepancies? It's also unknown. The interest rates are going in different directions, so we don't know what investment spending is going to do, so we won't know what economic growth is going to do. So a real, true, viable answer is I don't know, is unknown. That is a real answer on a multiple choice question, or a free response question is unknown. So now let's look at expansionary fiscal and then contractionary monetary. So expansionary fiscal is the increase in government spending, decrease in taxes, which will increase aggregate demand. Contractionary monetary policy is decreasing the money supply, which will increase the nominal interest rate, which will decrease investment spending, and then decrease aggregate demand. So we already know, first, aggregate demand is moving in different directions. We have expansionary fiscal increasing it, but then contractionary monetary decreasing aggregate demand. So we have some conflicting changes in spending here. They're not really working together. They're working kind of apart from each other. But let's see if we can figure out the ultimate change, the overall change to investment spending, and then the overall economic growth change. See if we can figure that out from our interest rates. So if we go to expansionary fiscal policy, we know this is going to lead to deficit spending. And when we deficit spend, we have to increase our demand for loanable funds, which will then increase the real interest rate. So we have an increase in the real interest rate and an increase in the real interest rate. So what's going to happen to overall investment spending? Well, it's going to decrease. Interest rates have gone up, so that means investment spending is going to decrease. Well, if investment spending is decreasing, what's going to happen to overall economic growth? It's going to decrease as well. So even though we have conflicting aggregate demand changes, we have the same interest rate change. These are moving in the same direction, which will then cause both of these to change as well, and it happens to be a decreased change. So let's look at contractionary fiscal and contractionary monetary. So in contractionary fiscal, we want to decrease government spending, and we want to increase taxes, both of which will decrease aggregate demand. Contractionary monetary is a decrease in the money supply, which will increase the nominal interest rate, which will decrease investment spending, which will decrease aggregate demand. So we have the same aggregate demand change. We're trying to decrease aggregate demand. So now let's look at the change to investment spending and then the change to economic growth from these policies working together. Let's see if they work together or work against each other. So contractionary fiscal is actually going to be surplus for decreasing spending but increasing taxes. That's surplus. We don't need to borrow, so we're going to be decreasing the demand of loanable funds, which will decrease the real interest rate. So we have a decrease in the real interest rate but an increase in the nominal interest rate. Well, they're going in different directions, so a change in investment spending is unknown. So what's going to happen to economic growth? It is unknown as well. Now let's do contractionary fiscal with expansionary monetary. So contractionary fiscal, we're going to decrease government spending, increase taxes, which will decrease aggregate demand. Expansionary monetary, we want to increase the money supply, which will decrease the nominal interest rate, which will increase investment spending, which will then increase aggregate demand. We have conflicting aggregate demand movements. So now we need to check what our change to investment spending and then the change to economic growth will be. So we already have our interest rate change in monetary policy. It's decreasing. So now let's see what's going to happen to contractionary fiscal. Well, this is a surplus. So when we are in a surplus, we don't need any loans. So we're going to decrease our demand of loanable funds, which will then decrease the real interest rate. So we have a decrease in the real interest rate and a decrease in the nominal interest rate. So what's going to happen to investment spending? Well, it will increase. And if we have an increase in investment spending, so we're purchasing more capital goods, we're purchasing more real estate, more things for growth, what's going to happen to economic growth? Well, it will also increase. So we do have some conflicting movements for aggregate demand, but our interest rate changes are going to show an increase to investment spending and an increase to economic growth. So to add one more layer of what could the answer possibly be, we have learned that unknown is a viable answer choice. So not only do we have increase, decrease, stay the same, we also have unknown. Isn't that so much fun? We also have a viable answer of unknown as a potential true answer here. So next class, we're just going to be practicing looking at expansionary and contractionary policies, working together, working against each other to make sure we're good with figuring out changes to the interest rates and what that's going to do to investment spending and economic growth in the long run.